Stories That Live in Us is a podcast that inspires you to form deep connections with your family, past, present, and future. I'm Krista Cowan, known online as the Barefoot Genealogist. I've spent my whole life discovering the power of family history, and I know that sharing the stories that live in you can change everything. In 2005, I stepped off a train platform in Glasgow, Scotland, and immediately burst into tears, which was odd because I was on a business trip. As a matter of fact, the man that I was there to meet was a professor at a university, and I had never met him before, but we'd communicated frequently via email. He walked up to me, this round man with a cigar in his mouth and a sports coat with patches on the elbows, and in a very thick Scottish brogue, he said, "Welcome to Scotland. You're Krista, aren't you?" And I stood there weeping. And he said, "Tell me what you're feeling." And I said, "I feel like I just came home," which was odd because I had never been to Scotland before. He said, "Well, you have Scottish ancestry, don't you?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Aren't you a genealogist?" Which of course then led us to back to his house, where I opened up my computer and pulled up my family tree and discovered that, yes, in fact, I do have Scottish ancestry. Now, here's why I didn't know that. I have been doing family history since I was a kid. You've heard me talk about that. But what you might not know is that of my 4 grandparents, one of them has a very, very well-researched family tree. My dad's mom came from very large families, very active in the LDS Church. And family history was very important to them. And so a lot of work, a lot of research had been done on that family tree. I had inherited that research, but I'd never paid attention to it before. And so what I discovered sitting at that farm table with that Scottish professor in Glasgow on that day in 2005 was that my grandmother's grandfather was born in Scotland. His name was Samuel Mulliner. He was born in January of 1809. In 1830, shortly after getting married to a widowed woman with 2 small children, the 2 of them decided they wanted to immigrate to Australia. Now, there was an economic downturn in Scotland, and his father was going to lose the family business. So Samuel and his wife decided to give most of their savings to his father to save the business, and they only had enough money left to immigrate as far as Canada. They brought those 2 children to Canada. They had 2 more children while living there. Eventually, they immigrated down into Ohio. Then they ended up out in Illinois. Now, in about 1839, Samuel decided, because of some religious obligations that he felt, to go back to Scotland. And he arrived back in Scotland 8 years after having left, having believed when he left that he was never going to see his family again, his parents, his siblings, his aunts and uncles and cousins. He arrived back in Scotland and had the opportunity to spend almost a year with them there before coming back to the United States. While he was there, he became the first missionary in Scotland for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he brought back with him some of his aunts, one of his brothers, several Scottish individuals who had joined the church while he was there. And they became the first group of Mormon pioneers who, instead of sailing into a port on the East Coast, sailed into the port of New Orleans and then switched to a steamer ship and went up the Mississippi River to join the body of the church in Nauvoo, Illinois. Now, I knew none of this when I stepped off that train platform in Glasgow. All I knew was that I felt like I had just come home. It was a feeling I was familiar with because I have felt that feeling 2 times previously in my life. One of those times was when I moved to the little town of Pleasant Grove, Utah, after having been raised in California and gone to high school in Oregon and Washington. I finished college and moved to Utah, and the day I moved into my little condo in Pleasant Grove, I walked out onto the balcony the first morning I was there, and looked up at Mount Timpanogos and felt like I had just come home. Because I knew that my grandmother's mother had been born in Pleasant Grove, Utah, and that my grandmother's father had been born in Lehi, Utah, and that every day of their lives they had looked up at that same mountain. What I didn't realize was that great-grandfather of mine born in Lehi, Utah, was the grandson of Samuel Mulliner, and now I had more stories to explore. Now, about that same time, as I started exploring more about the life of Samuel based on that trip to Scotland for work, I discovered that he had also helped settle Lehi, Utah. He had been one of the founding families here in this valley where I now live, where the Ancestry offices are headquartered. And I felt another instant connection to him that I hadn't known even was available to me before that. And that's one of the things about family history that I love, is that there are always more branches of our family tree to explore. There's always another line, another ancestor, another set of stories. And let me tell you, there was a set of stories to come with Samuel. And as I was uncovering that and discovering him, I decided, wouldn't it be a neat thing if in 2009 we have a reunion of all of his descendants to commemorate the 200th anniversary of his birth? And what if we do it right here in Lehi, Utah, in this town that he helped found? If you ever hear yourself say we should plan a reunion, just go take a nap. I'm convinced that we think these grandiose ideas and we don't realize how much work goes into it. Now, I say that mostly in jest because I love family reunions, but they are a lot of work. I had a 3-year head start on that work. The first task was, let's identify all of the descendants of Samuel. The first thing I uncovered was that after he had those 2 girls in Canada with his first wife, and then raised them, and then made his way to Illinois, and then to Nebraska, and then eventually across the plains with the Mormon pioneers into Utah, he ultimately fathered 18 children. Those 18 children produced 98 grandchildren, one of which was my dad's grandfather, Victor. And I knew my grandpa Victor. He was around when I was a little girl. He used to take me on rides in his rickety pickup truck around Los Angeles. At one point, my parents stopped letting me ride with him because he didn't believe in stoplights. He thought they were just suggestions. He was a character and he was a storyteller, and I loved my grandpa Victor. But somehow in all the stories he told me, it never clicked with me as a child that he was one of 98 grandchildren on his dad's side of the family. It's not even counting the cousins on his mom's side of the family. 98 grandchildren born to Samuel. Well, once I identified all 98 of those grandchildren, and the family had done a pretty good job of keeping track of them, so I had that information, the next task was to find the next generation, who are the great-grandchildren. So I set out on what is called a descendancy research project, and I had a timetable because I started it in 2006 after that trip to Scotland, and I wanted to have this reunion in 2009. By the time I had to draw a line in the sand and say, we've got to send out invitations for this reunion, I had identified 6,800 descendants from one man born 200 years earlier. That kind of blew my mind. Now, to be fair, not all 6,800 came to the reunion. As a matter of fact, it was less than 300 that came to the reunion. But we were able to have a 2-day celebration. It was an opportunity where my dad was able to reconnect with some of his first cousins and some of his second cousins that he hadn't seen since Mulliner family reunions when he was a kid. It was just a really enjoyable experience and a great opportunity for us to honor this ancestor and to see what stories other people in the family had. Because that's the thing about families, especially big families, is that different pieces of the story get passed down in different branches of the family tree. Sometimes it's because one person inherited all the photographs, or one person used to spend the most amount of time with grandpa, or one person was the oldest in the family and was very intentional about passing the stories they heard down to the next generation where others might not have been. And so when you gather families back together for reunions, one of the things that happens is all of those little pieces that got spread around the family start to get put back together. And that's what that reunion was the beginning of, was all of the pieces being put back together. And one of the things that happened from that was that I realized that Samuel was a lot more than just the scant little stories that we had heard about his leaving Scotland, immigrating to Canada, immigrating to the US, and ultimately coming out west. He was a character. He was an entrepreneur. He was an inventor. He was the very first tanner west of the Mississippi. He was a shoemaker. He was a wonderful provider for his family. He worked hard. He had several jobs. He started a couple of mills. I mean, he just was always working to provide, not just for his family, but for his community as well. And these stories started to come out as we started collecting the cousins. Now, there was something else that happened as we started collecting the cousins. One of the really fun things that happened right about that same time was that Facebook opened up to the general public. Of course, in the early days, Facebook was only available for university students. But when it opened up to the general public, one of the first Facebook groups that I created was a Samuel Mulliner Descendants Facebook group, and I started collecting cousins online. Now, those messages are always a little awkward. You don't know me, but here's how we're related, and I happen to know who you are and who your parents and grandparents are. But people were very gracious and often responded and joined the Facebook group. And one of the things that I watched happen in that group was how people who I had invited to join, maybe somebody out in California and somebody up in Idaho and out in Arizona, someone out in New York, these cousins that I was collecting as they came into this group, some of them started recognizing each other. Wait, why are you here? I'm related to Samuel Mulliner. I am too. Turns out these two individuals had been fishing buddies when they had been young fathers. Again, what are you doing here? Oh, I'm a descendant of Samuel Mulliner. So am I. Well, turns out those two individuals had, worked together at a job when they were, shortly before they retired. Another incident was we found out that my dad's mission president from when he had served a church mission, he was a member of this family. And for me personally, one of the most important connections I made because of Samuel was one of my college roommates was also a descendant of his. And we were able to reconnect after not having seen each other or spoken in years. So the serendipity of that was not an insignificant part of this experience for me. And it was always connected to Samuel, to the fact that we were part of this family of his that I was gathering and helping identify. In the midst of all of that, my mom, who is not his descendant because it's my dad's side of the family, she is, however, an English teacher, and she decided she wanted to work with me to write a biography about Samuel's life to make sure we captured all of these stories. And so my mom and I made a trip back to Scotland. And we went to record offices to make sure we found all the birth records for him and his siblings. We drove to the very north of Scotland, which is where Samuel's mother was from. And we found the church and we found the cemetery and we became acquainted with the land that created him. And there is something significant. I had felt it that first time I stepped off that train platform in Glasgow. I felt it as I walked through the churchyard up in Wick with my mom. There is something significant about walking in the footsteps of your ancestors, about being in the space that created them, the land that made them, the air that they breathed. I can't describe it unless you have felt it. That's the best I can do. But it's something that I encourage. And it doesn't matter if your family came from Scotland or if your family came from Colorado, take the opportunity if you can, because something almost tangible, connects us to those people through those places. And so as my mom and I went on this trip, this research trip through Scotland, I was able to feel those feelings again. But we were also able to uncover more stories about Samuel. By the time we came home, we dug into research libraries at Brigham Young University and the University of Utah. We went to the Utah State Historical Society. We went to the LDS Church Historical Society. All of these resources that we had to dig into more information about him. And one of the things that we uncovered was that he had actually been one of the few Mormon pioneers who had kept a journal during his crossing of the plains. It was a significant part of church history. It was also now a significant part of our family history. So as my mom and I wrote this biography about him, there was one other story about him that came out that became significant and impactful to me. If you don't know about the history of the Mormon Church, they were settled in Nauvoo, Illinois for quite a while. When the head of the church was murdered, the church members were driven out of Illinois by some angry mobs and had to cross the river in the middle of winter. And they were, a lot of them, in really destitute situations because they had to leave their homes and most of their possessions behind. Ultimately, they ended up in a place called Council Bluffs, Iowa, after crossing that state and finding some temporary refuge there. Samuel managed to bring his family, but one of the things that he did is, instead of staying in that settlement that group of individuals called winter quarters, he decided to take his small family north a little bit and see if he couldn't find work. I mentioned that he was very entrepreneurial and enterprising, and this was just another example of that. He got outside of the community and was able to bring money and resources into the community because of this move. One of the very first things he did was he earned enough money to get a wagon and a team of oxen, because the ultimate plan was to come west. They didn't know exactly always where they were heading, but west was the goal. And so he earned a team of oxen and a wagon and was ready to take his family west the next spring. And the leadership of the church actually came to him and asked him if he would donate that team of oxen and that wagon to another couple of families to use to go west. And he did it without hesitation. And so then he spent another summer and fall and winter earning enough money to purchase another team of oxen and another wagon so that the following spring he could take his family west. And again, the leadership of the church came to him and asked him if he would donate that to some other families so that they could make the trip. And he did, without hesitation. A third time, he earned enough money, bought the team of oxen, bought the wagon, and again, a third time, the leadership of the church asked him to donate that, and he did, without hesitation. So one of the stories that had been passed down in the family was that Samuel didn't come west with the majority of these Mormon pioneers who had been exiled out of Illinois until several years later. And there had always been, that story had always been shared with a little bit of a hint of criticism, like, why didn't he come? Why didn't he move west with the rest of them like he was supposed to do? Well, now as we found the rest of the story, we realized that he was actually making sacrifices every time for what he believed was the betterment of his community. And as I uncovered that story and realized that the fourth time that he earned that team of oxen and the wagon, he was able to finally bring his family west, I started to really understand him in a different way. And then as I connected the dots from that to the fact that he had always wanted to go to Australia, but had given his father enough money to save the family business years earlier, 20-something years earlier. As I then uncovered additional stories of his later life as he settled in Utah, helped found communities, helped to take care of destitute families, helped to buy businesses from individuals who weren't as business savvy, whose families were suffering because the business was failing, and then he would help it thrive again. Like, these stories just continued to unfold. And I came to recognize in him something of a kindred spirit for myself. Because one of the things that I have always felt so passionately about is that I always want to make smart financial and smart career decisions in such a way that if anyone in my life, family or not, ever needs assistance, that I'm able to step into that. And what I didn't realize is that maybe I got a little something of that from Samuel. As my mom and I collected these stories and ultimately ended up writing and publishing a biography about his life, I contacted the cousins, and I did it as a kind of self-publishing thing through a company called Blurb. I don't even know if they're still around, but one of the reasons I chose that route was because I didn't have to order or purchase a lot of inventory of those books and outlay a bunch of cash ahead of time. I could just publish the book online, and then it was a print on demand for anyone who wanted to order it. And so I sent out email blasts and messages in the Facebook group and let cousins know that they should purchase this book so that they could learn about him too. Not only was he this amazing main character individual in history, he also was this very critical part of our family tree. And I wanted people to know about him. I wanted them to have those stories about him and to see if maybe there wasn't something about him that they could see in themselves and in their own families. Certainly one of the things we found was the propensity to red hair. From everything we've been able to uncover, even though the only photographs we have of him are when he was older, and clearly, even though the photo was in black and white, he had white hair. Everything we've been able to uncover says he was a redhead. And as we collected the cousins, we uncovered this fact that a higher percentage, almost double, of the members of our family have red hair, including two of my brothers, than the general population. And we wonder, did that also come from Samuel? So as we published this book out to the family to encourage them to come to know him and connect with each other, there was just this really great response. In fact, some of my dad's first cousins, who still have the name Mulliner, wanted to learn more about him and talk more about him. And it became a topic of conversation often when we got together, the stories of Samuel. In 2012, when DNA came on the scene, that exploded the opportunities that we had to uncover more descendants. Remember, in 2009, I'd had to draw a line in the sand and say, we have to stop researching because we have to plan a reunion, and we'd had 6,800 descendants. With the advent of Ancestry DNA in 2012, over the course of about the next decade, as my dad and I would work on Sunday nights, about every third or fourth Sunday, we would work on the Mulliner family connections through DNA. And since then, we now have identified more than 10,000 descendants. And that number just keeps growing because the family keeps growing, because new babies are born as people, move on and grow up in life. And that's exciting to me, to know that there's a whole new generation of people that get to hear these stories about Samuel for the very first time. And so I continue to try to share what I know about him. I continue to try to make those connections because I think that's important. I think it's important that we know who our ancestors are, not just as a name on a pedigree chart or some dates and places even, but know as much as we can about them. I get that that's not possible for every ancestor we have. Not every ancestor we have has left the kind of legacy, the kind of paper trail, the kind of richness of information that Samuel's life left a trail of for us to find and gather. But there are clues. There are historical clues. There are places that can connect us to them. And there are certainly far more cousins than I think most of us realize. So your ancestor may not have had 18 children and 98 grandchildren. They may not have crossed an ocean. They may not have helped found a city, but maybe they left clues about the hard work that they put in or the sacrifice that they made. And I think there are things to learn from that as well. Here's the epilogue to this story, which is in a couple of years ago, I was talking to some of my dad's first cousins. I'm really close with them. I love spending time with them. And a group of them said that they wanted to go to Scotland and that they wanted me to take them there. I had been to Scotland with my mom on that research trip, but my dad had been still working full time in his career and just hadn't had enough time to take off to make the trip. He is now retired and was all in on a trip to Scotland. So in the summer of 2023, myself, my dad, 2 of my siblings, 5 of my dad's first cousins, and my dad's only living aunt flew to the UK. We had the opportunity to spend some time in London, and then we drove up through a little village called Odlum in Cheshire, which is where Samuel's father had been born. And then we drove up to Glasgow, which is where Samuel had spent time during his mission. And then we drove over to Edinburgh and spent time there. And the whole way, I had the opportunity, while driving a 15-passenger van from the wrong side of the car, on the wrong side of the road, filled with my family, to tell them stories. Stories that I had uncovered that were included in the book, stories that I had uncovered that we didn't include in the book, stories that I'd uncovered since I wrote the book. And to just be able to share those stories with them in that place was so meaningful to me. One of the most meaningful moments of that trip, I think, and there were many, but one of them, as we were leaving Edinburgh on the day we had spent touring there, my dad pulled up on his phone, he pulled up the Ancestry app and he opened the tree and he said, "Don't we have the address of where Samuel's parents lived when he came back in 1839 and found them?" And I said, "Yeah, we do. It's in the tree." So he pulled it up and he said, "Let's go look for that." We plugged it into the GPS and it was about 3 blocks from where we were at the moment. And we drove there. Now the house doesn't still stand. It's a parking lot in the middle of the city. But we pulled into that parking lot and we parked the van. And again, I was overcome with that feeling that I had come home. And I realized as I looked around the van sitting in that parking lot in Edinburgh, that it was as much about the people as it was about the place. The connection that we feel, not just to our ancestors, but to our living family, is one of the reasons why I love family history so much. And it's one of the reasons why these stories that connect us are so meaningful to me. So that's the story of Samuel, but it's also the story of me and the story of my dad and the story of my college roommate, Julie, who is and always was, but I just didn't know it, my 4th cousin. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Stories That Live in Us.